According to the International Labor Organization, 21 million people, men, women, and children, work in conditions of slavery around the world today. It represents 1 million more people than live in the entire state of New York. At Humanity United, we're committed to working within market systems to fight slavery. Over the past 5 years, we've invested $50 million in public policy, market, and social sector reforms, and we're on track to maintain that same pace, another $50 million over the next 5 years. Joining us today are leaders from different sectors, public, private, social sector, to provide their own reflections and perspectives on how we can work within the market to put an end to slavery once and for all. We have Carolyn Maloney, who is the U.S. representative from New York's 12th Congressional District. We have Ben Skinner, who's the co-founder and operating partner of Tau Investments and the founder of Transperindum. Erika Karp, who's the founder and CEO of Cornerstone Capital, and my good friend John Morrison, who's executive director for the Institute for Human Rights in Business in the UK. Help us understand, how common is it for people to be enslaved in the making of our products today?
Begin with a couple of basic facts. There are more slaves today than at any point in human history. Those that are forced to work, held through fraud, threat of violence for no pay beyond subsistence. You look at the largest 175 economic entities in the world today, now north of those are 60% are corporations, not countries. So the responsibility has shifted. The beautiful thing is business can do in 48 hours what governments can take 10 years to do. So leveraging the power of business is absolutely essential.
Yeah. Erika, you might be able to build upon that.
To give you some context, just the largest 10 companies by market cap in the world, all right, if you look at what they represent, it's something like the GDP of the UK, okay, to understand. Companies, the top 1,000 companies in the world represent something like 78% of the jobs. I mean, we're talking about incredible economic concentration. That means there is a responsibility. The point is, if investors want to know what their companies are doing, how they're using their capital, they want transparency. They want to understand what's going on in the production and deployment of the capital that makes the profits. And so it is going to be public-private partnerships, all right, P3s, that get things done. Complex problems can't be solved sequentially, all right? There need to be multiple parallel initiatives that converge on dealing with issues of education, healthcare, climate change, rebuilding infrastructure. We need to move trillions. Investors want predictive insight into what companies are doing. And this issue sits squarely in the realm of governance excellence, and that sits at squarely in the midst of corporate excellence.
John, I want to turn to you. What do you think contributes to the increase in vulnerability for migrant workers at the very end of that continuum?
What we see is supply chains are a very powerful tool here, but I've worked in business, and a CEO will say, well, we don't have trafficking in our supply chain, but it's very subtle, very, very subtle. And over the past 6 years, our work has shown that it's actually third-party labor providers. Every global supply chain that I have looked at has third-party labor provision coming in at some stage, and that is one of the key vulnerability points. So Randy, that's our work. Is we developed in Bangladesh 5 years ago, the Dakar Principles, 10 due diligence steps that any corporation can take to try and clean their supply chains. A call to action we have with CEOs at the moment is if business was to do just one of those things in the next few years, then end worker payments to third-party labor providers. It's against the law in most countries, but it's happening in most countries. And it is the one issue where corporates have huge leverage, because actually it's an economic issue more than a legal issue now. And
what about...
Could I just... One statistic. Yep. It's my understanding that something on the order of 40% of large companies don't have any formal processes in place that say you have to know deep into the supply chain.
That's why the UK legislation and the legislation that the Congresswoman's working on here is so important. And we're trying to get every government in the world to follow the lead of the UK and the US.
Congresswoman Maloney, tell us about the legislation at the highest levels and where we are in terms of that working its way through the halls of Congress.
Trafficking in persons is a third largest form of criminal activity, over $150 billion. It is preceded only by trafficking in drugs, trafficking in weapons, and trafficking in the human spirit and body. Only in the first two, you can sell a drug once, but you can sell the human body over and over again until they die. I believe working together, consumers and industry and government can end the 21st century form of slavery, trafficking in persons, by just letting consumers and business know what the policies are. Transparency, and that is what my legislation does. I also have a bill that would use the IRS to crack down on the pimps and the abusers of trafficking in persons.
Well, hopefully we'll join you next year in the passing of this bill.
I hope so too.
It's very exciting. Ben, so I don't know if you read Ben's bio, you'll see that he is a co-founder and one of the partners in one of the most unique investment firms that I've come across, and really sees upside around clean supply chains.
There's been this enormous consolidation to the bigger, better, faster, cleaner suppliers, those that are transparent, those that treat their workers well, those that have accountability practices in place and certainly standards in place. And simply put, what Tao is doing is seeking to bet on the winners, seeking to bet on those that are going to be dominating the field of supply at the manufacturing tier.
In the ESG, we've seen really progressive movement on the E, and I think solid movement on the G, but the social seems to be one that trips us up, which has always been a quandary for me. And so what's happening there from the investment community, or at least from your advocacy on ESG standards?
Of the ESG, the S is definitely the trickiest, but it's also arguably the most critical. Well, maybe governance is, but they all fuse together. And so I think it's a measurement issue that's challenging. So when we talk about impact investing, which some people call sustainable investing or double bottom line or triple bottom line, it is about impact, it is about outcomes. So there needs to be a greater understanding of complexity and nuance. And one thing that I will say is that Aristotle said that the perfect is the enemy of the good. And so if we wait for perfect measurements of outcomes, frankly, it's too damn late. Mm-hmm. And so now is the time to start figuring out how to sift through what the most material aspects by sector are. You know, we mentioned apparel, but look at the restaurant industry, the hotel industry, industries that are about human capital. All right, and then we start to think about, okay, what are the standards for behavior and standards for disclosure that we have to look at? Mm-hmm.
Ben, Erika, across the whole group here, what do you think those additional tools are that we need to be anticipating and perhaps even putting some money in?
Definitely putting money in, right? Okay. I mean, if you think about tools and you think about infrastructure, I mean, infrastructure is governance, right? So the tools, the enhanced analytics around assessing environmental, social, and governance factors towards profitability are critical. So you definitely need to put more money into
empowering the consumer. Yeah. Let the consumers know who are abusing, who is practicing slave trade in the 21st century and who is not.
This is one area where there are very concrete social indicators. Mm-hmm. No passport retention, mm-hmm. no worker fees to agencies.
In terms of being pragmatic, to try to start from a standpoint of respect, mm-hmm. right? So if you try to assume good intentions on the part of the private sector, try to assume good intentions on the part of the financial sector, mm-hmm. and look which companies can learn, or which organizations can learn from crisis.
And I hope other companies follow their lead.
Ben, let me have you come in here and offer up.
Specifically to your question, there will be more than 7 billion mobile subscribers within a year. That presents the largest potentially crowdsourced pool of labor information on Earth at any one time. Again, I come back to that theme. Companies may not be interested in transparency, but transparency is interested in that. Let
me close with this, all right, before we thank the panel. When you read the history of the 18th and 19th social reformers across the UK, they didn't see eye to eye. They did stand shoulder to shoulder in pressing for the greatest social reforms of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century. And I'm so pleased that we have this panel with us today who are standing shoulder to shoulder to address what is one of the biggest challenges in our modern era today. Please join me in giving them a thanks.
Thank you.